Thank you for joining us today. Kicking off our event is Maria de Jesus Lopez, a current Master of Public Administration graduate student at the Price School and the Professional Development Co-Chair for the Price Latinx Student Association.
Thank you, Katie. Good afternoon y buenas tardes. On behalf of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy and the Price Latinx Student Association, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. The mission of the Price Latinx Student Association is to engage undergraduate and graduate students on issues and policies that impact the USC Latinx community. We are thrilled to have Professor Claudia Maldonado joining us to share her learning on public policy in Mexico. Professor Claudia Maldonado is a Fulbright-García Robles visiting professor at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. Her research interests include comparative social policy, the political economy of distribution, and program evaluation in Latin America. She was the founding director of the Center for Learning and Evaluation and Results for Latin America and the Caribbean. Since 2020, she has been serving as council member at the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy, an autonomous agency in charge of the measurement of poverty and the evaluation of social policy in Mexico. She is passionate about promoting and advocating for rights-based and evidence-based social policy. Professor Maldonado, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Maria de Jesus, for a very generous introduction. And the first thing I want to say is that I'm honored to be participating in this dialogue with you during the Hispanic Heritage Month, and very grateful for the USC Price School of Public Policy for its very welcoming attitude and very warm reception of my visiting fall semester here. So before we start today, we're going to talk about poverty and social development policy in Mexico. And to warm up, I would like you to answer some poll questions just to have a sense of what your priors regarding the structure and the size of the Mexican economy are. Let's go for that poll. So I would like you to answer these questions: whether Mexico is among the 20 largest economies in the world, true or false; whether Mexico is a lower middle income country; and what your guess on the poverty rate in Mexico is. Okay, well, I think we already have a higher turnout rate than in most elections in the Western world, so I think we can probably go ahead. So the first question, the answer is yes. Mexico is the 15th largest economy in the world. Mexico is not a lower middle income country. Mexico is an upper middle income country that has an average income level above the global averages and the second in Latin America. And the poverty rate, which is very unfortunate, is above 50%. It's 52%, 52.8% with an income threshold, according to the last measurement made by Coneval this year in August. Okay, so the part of my interest in having you answer these questions is related to the fact that Mexico has much more human capital, natural resources endowment, and a geographically strategic and economically strategic environment than the one you would guess if you look at core social development indicators, if you look at poverty levels, if you look at the inequality, and of course, and if you look at the poverty, the regions with very high poverty that have had very high poverty levels and all kinds of deprivation levels for even since the colonial times. So what we are going to try to discuss today, and I'm very happy to be able to join this webinar with this topic, is trying to make sense of how this is happening and what social policy can do about it, and what social policy has so far, at least since democratization, failed so many Mexicans in the promise of inclusion, social upward mobility, and the expectation of a better livelihoods for the next generation, which is a core development objective and aspiration. So I wanted to start with a very well-known quote by the Baron Alexander von Humboldt, a German philanthropist and social researcher who traveled in Latin America extensively in the 19th century. And he wrote a very famous political essay called The Political Essay on the Kingdom of New Spain, then not an independent nation, and claimed in 1811 that Mexico is the country of inequality. Nowhere does there exist such a fearful difference in the distribution of fortune, civilization, cultivation, soil, and population. What has happened since? And what strikes me as a paradox and something we should be thinking about is that Mexico is a relatively developed country. It's an upper middle income country. It has a population of 126 million. It's the second largest economy in Latin America. It's the 15th largest economy in the world. It's the 5th in terms of biodiversity. It's the 8th in terms of tourist destination, which also secures an important source of hard currency revenue. It's an open economy that arguably has signed more free trade agreements than any other nation in the world, which in principle gives us access to around 60% of global GDP and 50% of global trade, which is, of course, a lot of opportunity if you think of a very open economy strategically located next to the most important economy in the world, which is the US, and having access to all these potential markets. It is also a diversified economy. It's an industrial nation with oil production, mineral exploitation, and high quality and highly sought after agricultural production. Avocados, tomatoes, oranges, you know. If we look at the GDP per capita in purchase parity terms, Mexico is not doing so bad. It's about around 18,000. If you compare it to Brazil, to the US, or to the world, you can see that it is, although of course it's not a rich country, but it is a country that has a lot of natural endowments, resources. It has been increasingly skilled. It has acquired higher literacy rates and human capital levels in the last 30 years. And still we have formidable social development challenges. If you look at this is the last measurement. As you might want to know, Mexico was the first country to enact an official mandatory multidimensional measurement of poverty in charge of Coneval, an institution to which I serve as member. And with this measurement, we capture poverty rates according to the standard income levels, but we also capture the social gaps in access to the social rights granted in the Mexican Constitution, which are school, health, social security, the quality of housing quality, access to basic service in housing, and access to sufficient and nutritious food nutrition. Okay, I think there is a question. There are some people who have some trouble with the audio. Let me know if I have to stop. So, like you see here, this is the last measurement. We are talking about over 50% of the population below the poverty line, most of them working full-time or even 2 jobs. We have a still very high 17.2% of people living under extreme poverty, which basically means that if someone spent 100% of their income, it would be insufficient to buy the basic food basket to promote a functional biological development, which, as you can imagine, in terms of early childhood development, is a huge, huge problem, because younger people are overrepresented in this group of households living in extreme poverty. We also have that almost 20% of the population have less education than they should according to their age. We have 28.2% of the population who do not have access to healthcare. Mexico has a national public healthcare system, which nevertheless never managed to become truly universal, because the entry point for health services is joining the formal labor market, which is less than half of the labor market in Mexico in the last 2 or 3 decades. Social security is a huge problem. Half of the population don't have access to social security, precisely for this entry point according to employment. And the quality, something that was especially difficult, adverse for households during the pandemic, was the bad quality of housing conditions, and the fact that many households do not have direct access to water and direct access to basic things that make life livable within confinement. And of course, every 10 Mexicans does not have access to basic sufficient nutritional intake. This is something that sharply contrasts with the social development picture with other measures of the size of the Mexican economy, the productivity of the Mexican economy, and how Mexico has definitely modernized in industrial, in commercial, and in urban terms in the last 20-25 years. So why is this problematic? This is a very high level of poverty, and it's also, we are one of the two most unequal countries in the region, which is already the most unequal region in the world. Brazil and Mexico are the champions of inequality in the region, which is also counterintuitive given the large of their economies and the muscle of their development strength and international relevance in economic terms. So why is this problematic? There are many reasons for this. First, it's a human and social rights issue. It's a social justice issue. There are persisting and increasing gaps regarding, if we look from an intersectionality perspective at some of these aggregate measures that I shared with you, the pictures are even worse. Look, there's the probability of being poor for indigenous people is 4 times than for non-indigenous people. If you look at what happens between the rural and the urban sectors, we still do have, although we have above 92 literacy rate nationwide, we have a lot of municipalities that still have over 80% of illiteracy rates, and they are mostly indigenous and, of course, extremely poor. If you look at the gender gap, specifically after the pandemic, and some emerging age gap, which means that people who are under 18 are starting to be overrepresented in the composition of poverty in Mexico, which is something that we should worry about if we think about long-term life cycle effects. And there is all this evidence about how poverty and inequality hinder growth, hinder development, hinder security, and also can put democratic institutions at risk. In general, poverty and inequality, this is something that worries a lot, specifically in the Latin American context, is that they enable and promote political polarization and violent crime. So according to some recent evidence, it is not a coincidence that Latin America is the most unequal region in the world and is also one of the most violent regions in the world, measured by homicide rates, which is a very, hard indicator of the level of violence. So, of course, a very important part of social development is anchored to economic development itself. But today I want to talk to you about the role of social policy, because that's my research expertise, and also because I think there are a lot of windows of opportunity, especially after democratization, to actually make social policy truthful to the constitutional mandate of social rights in Mexico and deliver for the majority of the Mexican poor. So what is the role of social policy in this picture, especially when countries are not extremely poor and you cannot directly link poverty to absolute scarcity, which is a different development challenge, as I have tried to emphasize. So social policy, you can use it as a platform for progressive transfers for redistribution, which can give people a first chance with equal opportunity to advance socially and economically. It can provide a safety net or a social protection against negative shocks, natural disasters, negative economic downturns, earthquakes, commodity price shocks, financial crisis, etc. It can promote indirectly through redistribution and through having specially targeted and affirmative action to reach out to the most vulnerable. It can also provide for younger citizens who come from very poor backgrounds basic endowments associated with the provision of public goods and services, basic endowments in terms of health, in terms of education, and in terms of fair opportunities for advancement. Of course, social policy, if well targeted and genuinely progressive, it can provide public goods and services, paying special attention to those who are more vulnerable and who are more dependent on public provision to secure livelihoods, which means a proper public good provision. And of course, social policy can help with economic and social risk management through the life cycle. We are living in a society with global threats such as climate change and natural disasters that basically point out to the need to include risk management and resiliency against shocks as a core concern for social policy. So what has happened with social policy in Mexico? In general terms, Mexico since the 1980s has undergone the type of pro-market liberal structural reform that most Latin Americans and many developing countries undertook after the debt crisis in 1982. So in general, we are closely committed to a very open economy that seeks to profit from globalization and seeks to benefit from the comparative advantage that our geographic proximity to the US market can offer in an open and globalized world. But what has happened in terms of social policy? I will give you a very brief overview of the long-term developments of social policy. Basically, during the 19th century, remember I started with Alexander von Humboldt's quote. So basically, at the time when Alexander von Humboldt was struck by the levels of inequality and poverty that he found in then New Spain, thereafter Mexico, was that there was a very small residual social justice endeavor associated with the church, with philanthropy, and the works of piety. It is only with the Mexican Revolution that of 1910, that is a popular and peasant revolution with a redistributive agenda, that we get a constitution that specifically claims that Mexicans have social rights. This was the first constitution that included social rights, which aren't related to access to things and means for being in the 20th century. The problem was that they were merely stated in the constitution, and as you can see from the multidimensional measure of poverty that I shared with you, we have huge gaps in the effective access to social rights in Mexico. Then during most of the 20th century, we had an authoritarian system, basically a hegemonic party system in which one party that came triumphant after out of the revolution always won all the elections, no? Surprisingly. So this entailed a captured social policy in which all the incentives and the institutions and the push and pull factors that are associated with democratic governance were not working well. So social policy was corporatist. What does it mean? That the state selectively channeled benefits, support, and access to rights to corporations that were directly controlled by the state. And these corporations were trying to include society as a whole, but they were never genuinely inclusive and universal. So you would have special access for the leaderships of certain unions that were captured. You have special benefits and programs and subsidies and access to grains and to fertilizers and all kinds of support through peasant organizations that were also captured by state elites and political brokers, and also business chambers. The business elite in Mexico during the 20th century is a product of state sponsorship and a kind of crony capitalism that depended a lot on exchanging economic benefits for political loyalty. So this piece that was bought through selective incentives for corporations worked relatively well until the late 70s. Because during that time, it's called the Mexican miracle time. The Mexican economy was growing above 6-7% per year. The urban economy was becoming very modern. That was the time of the biggest boom and spillover in infrastructure. And it was somehow a manageable political economy equilibrium because although Mexico was a poor and rural country, Mexico was opening opportunities for upward social mobility within the authoritarian logic. This is something that I want to emphasize. So what happens after the 80s? The 80s, with the debt crisis of Latin America and structural reform, basically collapsed the ability of the state to buy out clienteles. We were forced into really cutting social spending due to the debt crisis and the structural reform. And we have an emergence of small targeted social programs that were trying to not to promote more effective public service provision and public good provision for the majority of the population, but trying to reach out to the weakest links in terms of development, trying to become better targeted so that with relatively low incomes and spending effort, the worst of the manifestations of poverty could be alleviated and eased. The bad story is that since the 80s, and even in this century, these programs have not been very effective, with the exception of Progresa, the conditional cash transfer, which started in 97. Most of these programs were epiphenomenal, and they were captured by political brokers on the ground, which means that we have a social policy that is clientelistic, it's regressive, which means that more money go to the people who are relatively better off on average, and the outcome, the net outcome is that the poor have been under not so benign neglect by the Mexican state. So after the 90s, and so most people date the real proof of democratization in 2000, when the PRI, the hegemonic party, lost the presidential run for the first time in history of the start of democratization. And our expectation of democratization and of political competition in terms of social development that come from the literature and also from the evidence in comparative development, one would expect that with democratization, there would be an expansion of citizen rights that would promote political competition and government responsiveness. So we would have better social policy, specifically because the majority of the voters in Mexico are poor, and the median voter would have a preference for redistribution in favor of a stronger, more progressive, universal public social policy. The idea is that democracies redistribute power in favor of the less privileged. Every vote counts, and if in a country that many voters are poor, one expects political economic conditions and incentives to shape policy differently. And if we follow down, well, if the median voter is poor, what do we expect from public policy? What should it look like? Well, it should look like poor public policy. And if the majority of voters are poor, we should have seen a change in social policy discourse, social policy instrument, and of course, social policy outcomes. What happened? Well, some of these promises are still unfulfilled, as I show with the social development measurements we have. With democratization, we regained a slow path of economic recovery with market-oriented reforms and the establishment of safety net approaches for social policy. We adopted the human capital paradigm, best exemplified in the conditional cash transfer program, which is a international development poster child, the Prospera, which is an evidence-based, well-targeted, and mostly very effective human development program. But during this time, surprisingly, if from a democratic and inclusiveness perspective, inequality and exclusion are not part of the mainstream policy social debate. We are still expecting that the export-led economy will provide for spillover effects that will take care of poverty and exclusion on their own. And for this reason, we provide small programs that are safety nets, emergency, plan B, social protection kind of schemes, because we expect the market and globalization to drive people out of poverty through market inclusion. And this is something that did not happen for many reasons, and we can talk about it later. Also, with democratization, there was this strong push to professionalize and to make social policy more transparency, because opposition parties did not want the government to be able to capture social policy like it was the case during the authoritarian regime. So this is a time of a lot of legislation that provides basic guarantees that legislates social rights, the social development law, for instance, and creates a push towards performance-based management, evidence-based and transparent social policy as a way of going away from the clientelistic, electorally driven manipulation of social policy that characterized our authoritarian period. And of course, there was a remarkable increase in social spending in the last 30 years and a small increase in the progressivity of social transfers, which means that the Mexican state was more able to reach out to those who are poorest during the last 30 years. At the same time, the amount spent for this type of social transfers that are progressive has always been less than 0.3 of GDP. And according to some estimates, we would need at least 2.5 or 3% of GDP to cover the extreme poverty gap in progressive terms. Okay, so this is the story. We come from a tradition of clientelistic public policy that served political order functions and therefore did not promote social rights. And at the time of democratization and market-led reform, we had a lot of hope as policymakers and as a country, like many developing countries, that the muscle of economic development would massively incorporate excluded Mexicans, including the indigenous, including rural areas. This did not happen. And now we have persisting challenges, although the economy is not growing so well in the last decade. And although we are not, strictly speaking, a poor country, we are an upper middle income country filled with social development indicators of a very, very poor and deprived country. So during this time, some good things have happened. I don't want you to give you the impression that social policy is doomed. We have an institutional setting that enables that social program architecture is evidence-based, is more explicitly redistributive, and it's results-oriented. This is through the law of social development, the creation of Coneval, and the push towards performance-based budgeting in Mexico. We also have a significant fiscal effort for targeted programs. But at the same time, overall, many public policy and social policy institutions are still regressive, like Social Security. And with democratization and political competition, a lot of new local governments and state governments bring their new social policy ideas and their programs to the table. And the result in a complex and unequal federal system has been a lot of social policy fragmentations. So we have a lot of programs with very little evidence of effectiveness, and we have a very dispersed and fragmented social policy effort if you look at it in territorial terms. We are also systematically underfunded. Mexico is, after Guatemala, is the country that has the lowest revenue as a percentage of GDP in the region, which suggests that even the best efforts are going to be insufficient in terms of budget. And there is the persistence that coexists with democratization and party competition of clientelistic traits. And the problem with clientelism is that political resources are associated with material resources. And when clientelist networks capture social policy, they become more regressive. So the social programs are unable to reach out to the poorest of the poor, which is a priority objective for social development in Mexico, according to the Constitution and according to present laws. And of course, we have a lot of tensions between trying to have a universal social rights system in a country that is so unequal and trying to protect very pro-poor targeted programs from the backlash of the middle classes. Because very unequal countries with middle class bias in public policy, in the process of public policy, creates a lot of political economy incentives against pro-poor interventions. And this is something that we have experienced very clearly after democratization. And something that became very evident during the pandemic, and that scholars had pointed out for many years, is that we lack a comprehensive stance on social protection to protect people from economic shocks, from downturns, and prevent the intergenerational transmission of poverty. So as concluding remarks, I would only say that the pandemic revealed the structural inequalities that in 1811, Alexander von Humboldt was already highlighting, but it also exacerbated new dimensions of social inclusion and inequality, such as a more profound gender gap as a result of the economics of care, bigger implications of the huge digital gap that there is in Mexico, which is going to produce a huge setback in education gains and coverage for young Mexicans. And it also put the highlight on urban social exclusion and poverty. Historically, social policy in Mexico has focused more on the rural poor. Increasingly, Mexico is a predominantly urban economy that has specific urban dynamics with poverty and exclusion that require a lot of attention, especially among the younger Mexicans and especially among girls. So I would just like to finish sharing with you this concern that I have that despite democratization, despite significant improvements in the institutional design of social policy, we still have to face a lot of political economy, technical and financial challenges in order to be able to build back better, to come out of the pandemic as a country that has a stronger social protection system that enables the Mexican society to be resilient for the next crisis is something that requires major changes in the policy matrix. And this is problematic because we have a political economy equilibrium that has made fiscal reform very, very difficult and has made aggressive compensating measures have a lot of backlash by the middle class and the public opinion. And also because we still have a very low transparency index levels in terms of budget and public policy, it is very hard to buy support, political support for a fiscal reform that could finally try to make the social mandate of the Mexican Constitution a reality. So here I would like to stop. I think I spent a little more time than expected, and I appreciate your attention and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Maldonado. We appreciate your learning and knowledge. So we do have a few questions from the audience, and I'll start with the first one. It is, where does the marginalization of the women in Mexico, specifically the Northern Triangle and elsewhere, fit in due to the tenets of Catholicism and a lack of reproductive care, which causes forced motherhood?
Wow, that's a big question. I will only say three things. The first thing is that if we look, Mexico is the third worst Latin American country in terms of the economic gap, which means that economic inclusion faced by Mexican women is the third worst in the region. Although we do have we have maternity leave and some basic reproductive and social rights associated with Social Security, the fact that 50% of the population doesn't have access to Social Security through formal employment naturally neglects a lot of women. And secondly, if we look at the labor participation of women in Mexico, it's mostly informal and it's mostly precarious because it's flexible. And this is associated with the lower skills, the wage gap, and the economics of care, which is basically invisibilizes the contribution of women to the economy and makes it very difficult for women to participate in equal opportunities with their male peers. This is something that happens everywhere. This is something that for Latin American standards, it's very bad in Mexico. And this is something that was hugely exacerbated by the pandemic. There are many hypotheses. There are hypotheses about patriarchy. There are hypotheses about the Catholic mindset. There are many hypotheses. But what I will say is that we have evidence from other countries that actually gender focus and adopting the gender perspective in public policy can help reduce these gaps. And which is something that ECLA, the Economic Commission for Latin America, has emphasized recently, that if we want to come back to a healthy development pattern in Latin America, we have to make reducing gender inequality a key economic priority, not only because of social justice or of the intrinsic dignity of women as citizens and individuals, because without 50% of the assets, of the economic power and of the potential of the economies, we will not be able to recover.
Thank you. So the next question is, has NAFTA had a positive or negative impact for most Mexican citizens?
Your questions are fantastic because they are very tricky. So if we look, what has happened with NAFTA is that it has definitely been very valuable for the Mexican economy as a whole, but the ability to profit from the opportunities of NAFTA is concentrated regionally in the north and is concentrated in the relatively high skill sectors of the economy, which basically means that it has not contributed to the reduction of inequality. So you can see how there is convergence of some northern areas of Mexico with some of the indicators of the US economy, which is a very good sign of development, but we still see most of the southern Mexico completely isolated in economic, social, and political terms. So there has been a skill premium in the benefits of NAFTA, and that also applies to sectors like, standard trade theory predicts. The tradables have benefited more, the non-tradables not so much.
Great, thank you so much. We have another really excellent question. Could you please talk a little bit more about the digital challenge for the young population? Are there any gender differences or regional differences?
Yes, I don't remember the exact number, but I will tell you that we are we have the fourth largest digital gap in Latin America, and Latin America is lagging in terms of digital inclusion if you compare it to Southeast Asia, for example. And what through Coneval, we do a lot of research regarding these matters. And what we have found is that the digital gap is so closely correlated with rural environments and poor households that it really exacerbated the exclusion of poor households during the pandemic and the inability to access education services. The Mexican government enacted education services through television, but this is also an issue in households that have more than one child in schooling years, and it's a huge problem. Now, I think that at least a good thing is that we are much more aware of the absolute need as a country to prioritize digital inclusion as part of educational policy and health policy. And I think this in optimistic terms, because I think we are gathering momentum for a more aggressive move against digital exclusion, because we have seen how dangerous and how further unequalizing it can be during a time of crisis like this. And of course, we're in the middle of the 21st century, the fourth industrial revolution. The digital gap is the same as the literacy gap in the past.
Thank you. Here's another great question. Could you share if there are any successful examples of social policies implemented in the Mexican context to tackle inequalities phenomenons in urban contexts, or are most of them still focused on the rural context?
I will say that still, although we have already been doing a lot of program evaluation in the last 15 years in the country, the availability of evidence on effectiveness is scarce. So we don't know the effectiveness on many programs precisely because we have like an expansion of programs with democratization. We have over 800 different programs scattered in the 3 levels of government. And the average local government has over 40 programs. State government has over 40 programs. But from what we know, what really stands out is the conditional cash transfer program, Prospera, Progresa, Oportunidades. It was evidence-based. It was evaluated with a rigorous impact evaluation, experimental impact evaluation, and it has systematically produced good outcomes in terms of nutrition, school attendance, better protein consumption in the households, and some good spillovers in household level well-being. However, first thing, this government canceled the program. This was the most progressive item in the Mexican budget, which means it was a social program that really reached out to the poorest of the poor, as opposed to other programs like Social Security or pensions, which are very urban and are regressive. And unfortunately, this program was discontinued. But we also learned that some of the assumptions of the human capital paradigm did not become reality. So because the education services are of bad quality, and because the labor dynamics have not been as expected as a result of NAFTA, we do not get upward social mobility and the break of intergenerational poverty transmission through this program. But we do get human capital development for the poorest, which is in itself an important outcome.
Thank you, Professor Maldonado. Our last question, are there any opportunities for the United States and Mexico to undertake joint actions to reduce poverty in both countries?
Of course. This is something that, and this is general for the expectation of a global dynamic economy with open democratic governance. To the extent that human mobility cannot catch up with trades and good mobility, and there are these huge disparities, we are going to have international migration that can create domestic backlash in the receiving countries, and that can create a lot of tension in terms of human rights and border issues. So to the extent that if we bet on a genuinely globalized economy and regional spaces for development, there is a lot that we can do to promote development in the NAFTA region, in the TMEC region, with a long-term partnership perspective. But I know this is a hard sell for domestic constituencies, because it is hard to communicate that the US has to put so much more effort in promoting development in the southern border, south of the border. And this is in the best interest of the American economy itself. And the same happens in Mexico. We have a hard time selling to democratic domestic constituency that it is imperative that Mexico, as a relatively stronger economy, really reaches out in solidarity and partnership with Central American economies. So there is a political economy incentive because we do not clearly communicate as policymakers, as politicians, to the average citizen that this can be a win-win situation in the long run. And I think that's a myopic policy trap, and I think it's persistent, unfortunately.
Professor Maldonado, thank you so much for sharing your research and insight on such an important topic. I look forward to seeing all of the new conversations that will come from this talk. In the spirit of coming together on behalf of the Price Latinx Student Association, I'd like to invite our Los Angeles audience members to join us for the Price Latinx social event at Mercado La Paloma today at 6. It's near campus. This is an opportunity to meet the Price Latinx Executive Board and continue with our most pressing public policy discussions, much like the one we had today. You can get all the details for tonight's social event on our Instagram page at USC Price Latinx. We hope to see you there. Thank you again for joining us today. And once again, thank you, gracias, to Professor Maldonado for sharing her expertise with us.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure joining you.